Hi, you clicked onto today's tropical tidbit for Thursday. Things are starting to get more active in the Atlantic now. Notice all the clouds starting to show up in the Caribbean over here. And these are all associated with the intertropical convergence zone, which is lifting farther north than normal. You can see it going roughly through here and lifting right north out of South America and right into the Caribbean, and we're starting to see an area of low pressure organize over here, which is Invest 92L, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the overall pattern is very interesting here. If you look at this area, if you can see the low level clouds, notice how they're moving very little. There's very little trade wind flow from east to west over here. In fact, there's very little movement in any direction. The flow is very, very weak across this entire area of the Atlantic, and I forgot to put up the steering map to prove it to you, but there is very little wind flow in here. And this, if we use our reasoning, if we think about this, if there's very little wind flow, that means there must be a very weak meridional pressure gradient, which means that the pressures up here are going to not be very different from the pressures down here. There's not much of a difference between the two. Weak pressure gradient, which means that pressures must be either lower than normal up here or higher than normal down here, or both, and it happens to be both. And here's the proof: the anomalies for the last 30 days. You see lower than normal pressures up here over the Atlantic and higher than normal pressures over the Eastern Pacific and Northern South America, and that would be because of all the cold water in here due to La Nina, and all the warm water in the Atlantic due to the warm AMO and other things which have caused the pressures to lower over here. And this causes, when you have lower pressures over higher pressures, you get weaker trade winds through here, and it produces an ideal environment for the intertropical convergence zone to lift northward, farther north than normal. And so instead of having all the monsoonal activity going off in the Eastern Pacific, we start having things get going in the Caribbean. And this is going to be a very interesting situation over the next week or more, because this area of low pressure, given the weak steering flow, is not going to be moving very fast, and it could take an entire week just to get over here into the Western Caribbean. It could be as much as 10 days to 2 weeks for it to make any kind of a landfall in this area of the world, but we'll get to that track in a minute. Taking a close-up view at this, you can see an area of low pressure probably right around here, south of Barbados. And this is going to be gradual for development. If we zoom back out, we can see that there's a lot of subsidence sort of going on over here. And this is another interesting thing to mention, is that this whole idea of activity ramping up in here right now fits with the thought that there's a correlation between Cape Verde activity in the central Atlantic and Caribbean activity. Remember, when we had the storm train, we had Danielle, Earl, Fiona, all coming up here and recurving. Lots of big major hurricane activity in this area. When you get a lot of hurricanes running through in succession, you get this broad area of net low pressure and cyclonic turning in here. So all the hurricanes running through gives a westerly component to the winds in here, but the trade winds are still out of the east and southeast in here. So the air is spreading apart from each other, and you get surface divergence in the Caribbean, which induces sinking air, dry air, and you get no activity because the hurricane train to the north is shutting everything down to its south. But now that the hurricanes are gone, we're left with more sinking in here than we had before, which is incubating upward motion and allowing the intertropical convergence zone to come northward. So that's another reason why we're getting activity down here. And the subsidence in here means that the air is fairly dry, and there's not many outflow channels available for outflow to get going in here, and the dry air is pressing down from the north. But I think this will end up in the end not being too big of a deal for this system. I think it'll gradually start moistening up the area here in the Caribbean, and it'll start getting more of an upper anticyclonic flow going around it here in the course of a few days, and I think that gradually conditions will become more and more favorable, and this will go ahead and try to develop, although gradually due to some of these limiting factors and the fact that it's within the intertropical convergence zone, and developments within there of low pressure generally take a while to spin up because they have to focus the convergence in one area, and the ITCZ likes to hog it and spread it out. So these developments are generally gradual anyway. Now if we go over here and look at the European, this is the day 9 image over here from 0Z last night, and we see Igor over here. That's what's currently south of the Cape Verde Islands right now, and it tries to recurve this out. It brings another storm up behind, and you can see where this would be Juliet, I believe, came from the low that we're talking about here, east of the Antilles, brings it pretty much westward, brings it up into the Western Caribbean, then straight west across the Yucatan and right into Mexico. And the reason it's doing that is because of this big ridge that it builds over the central United States. And the idea that we're seeing from some of the models here, the GFS also takes this into Mexico ultimately, the operational run at least. The idea is that if Igor is recurving, there has to be a big trough, mid-level trough, recurving this out. And if there's a trough here, there's a big ridge here. And if Juliet is sitting in the Western Caribbean, then it has nowhere to go but westward, right into Mexico. And if we had a ridge sitting over here, this would be a blocking mechanism that would protect the United States Gulf Coast from any threat. But here's the trick. We've got a couple of models that are seeing some things differently. We have the Canadian brings this straight northwest, and then near the islands in this sort of a fashion. The no gaps also follows a similar solution. The reason it might do that is because if this trough is digging in enough to try to recurve Igor, it could possibly try to lift this system north before it turns west-northwest, and in such a situation, if it has already gained this latitude before starting to come west, it could have more of a chance to get through the ridge far enough north to affect the United States at some point. But the pattern is rather fragile right now in terms of the model's handling of it, and each run is showing different things from run to run, which means that the pattern is very dynamic, and there are a lot of things that can change on this. Now, it's interesting to look at the European ensembles, sort of showing the same thing. The operational run has been consistent so far, taking this west, but if we look at the day 6 500 millibar here, we see this trough digging in off the eastern seaboard, which will eventually try to pick up Igor out in the eastern Atlantic. The ensemble mean, remember, these colors show the differences between the ensemble members, meaning disagreements. We can see that there are two possible locations that the European members think that Juliet could be. This is the operational has it in here. You can see one set thinking it'll be in the northwestern Caribbean in 6 days. The other set thinks that this trough over here will produce enough of a weakness in the ridge that this will be able to be drawn north towards eastern Cuba or Jamaica and be more displaced to the northeast in 6 days. And notice how slow the movement is. It goes from the Antilles to here in 6 days, which is a lot of time. Again, that slow steering flow. If we go out to day 8, we can see that the trough a little more flatter out here as the ridge starts to build in. The ridge is building in stronger over here. The operational run has the low in here by day 8. You can see that there's a disagreement. Anywhere from here to all the way south of Cuba is where the ensembles think the low could be. If the low is right here south of western Cuba, people would be getting worried in the situation. If it has already gained this latitude, a west-northwest track could take it towards Texas. So at this point, the models that are showing that are cause for concern. If we go out to day 10, we see the big ridge pumping over here. The operational run has it inland at this point, but there's an ensemble spread anywhere within this area. And again, if it's in here near the Yucatan Channel, then you can get this trough coming across, push this ridge to the east, and then it has an open door right for Texas instead of Mexico. And usually tracks that end up through the Yucatan Channel generally don't hit Mexico. Sometimes they do, but generally it becomes the United States that is more threatened. And this track could have similarities to Allen if it were to occur like this. I'm not saying it will. There's a lot of speculation going on 10 days out. So, but this is a pattern which is cause for concern. The pattern is such that the Caribbean will be lighting up, and there is a very dynamic pattern in progress, and the wavelengths are shorter than normal right now because the Arctic Oscillation and North Atlantic Oscillation are negative, meaning that pressures are higher in the Arctic, lower in the mid-latitudes, so the wavelengths are shorter. So the trough over here, which normally would end up in higher heights over here during the hurricane season, is instead resulting in higher heights back here over the central United States. So there's some disagreement amongst the models with the wavelengths and the timing, so it's going to be critical to see how fast Juliet, if she develops, gets into this area in here. And you can see the ensemble spread in timing alone, not just the track but the timing, because again the steering flow through here is so slow that the models are naturally going to have disagreements as to how fast this storm will actually move westward beneath this ridge. So there is a lot of issues with timing going on. But the message is that the Caribbean is lighting up, and there could be a potential threat to the Mexican coast, United States Gulf Coast, and even perhaps Cuba and Jamaica. We'll have to see how things go. And if we go out into the long range, day 15 on the GFS ensembles, look at all the precipitation still sitting in the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, Southwest Atlantic. Big area of sub 1008 millibar pressures in here. And this is a pattern that is really setting up things to light up in this area, and this is going with the thought that when the Cape Verde season starts to wind down, which it will eventually by the end of this month, we'll stop seeing that train come off. The activity will not go away, it will simply shift west, and this is the kind of pattern that with low pressures in here, and if we get that ridging pattern over the northeastern US, you open the door for tracks to come into the United States, and this is when we could start racking up those landfalls. So the model is seeing where storms could be for a while, and we might start seeing the Caribbean spawn a few of its own, so we'll be keeping an eye out for that. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.